we're really excited today to be joined by several fantastic panelists. First, Alun Davies, Senior Program Manager of the Global Health Network and MESH, which is a fantastic resource that really looks at community and stakeholder engagement and provides some invaluable resources and case studies. We also have Sally Molyneux, Professor of Global Health at KEMRI-Wellcome Trust Research Program, as well as Dr. Robin Vincent, who's an independent consultant with Sheffield Center for Tropical Medicine and Global Health at Oxford University, who's been doing and really leading some fantastic work around the monitoring evaluation with Wellcome Trust. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm actually going to just begin sort of framing the conversation, and let's just make sure I can share my slides with everyone. Great. So we're just going to get started just to offer a bit of a framing. So the first is the GPP body of evidence. This is really what we've come to talk about. This is on the avac.org website, and we're happy to link it. But this body of evidence really looks across several critical pieces, one of which is monitoring evaluation. It looks at both thinking about the case studies that are happening within the GPP landscape, tools to both conduct and evaluate engagement, and really think about the work planning around it, some of the ethical papers and frameworks that really root how good practice is thought about and what are the qualities of good participatory practice or good engagement. But one of the pieces and the focus of the webinar today is on the monitoring and evaluation. And evaluating GPP is really challenging when we evaluate engagement, because how do we think about the framework of what are we looking at? And something that our panelists in particular, Sassy and Alun, will talk a bit about that, in thinking about the real idea of what is the value add, what are we actually trying to measure when we think about engagement. And this is actually some of the smallest section here. And so this is the biggest gap that we see when we think about stakeholder engagement, is thinking about how do we measure and monitor what is good practice. And so I wanted to share a few examples, but the first of which we know that engagement should be meaningful. It's collaborative, it's a reciprocal process, and it's really about building trust. And how do you measure trust over time? And how do you measure which methodologies and which mechanisms that you're deploying are actually helping you to achieve your goal? And so that's really the basis of where engagement begins and where this work starts. And something that, again, I'll share a few examples to kind of frame the way this looks that are in our body of evidence. But this is really the root, is how do we talk about or how do we measure this trusting relationship over time? And I think one of the critical pieces is measuring stakeholder movement. And when we think about engagement and what the goal is, there's obviously some of the ethical considerations on why we do this for participant protection or for, ensuring good quality research. But it's also about potentially raising awareness and capacity building. And so this is a really nice chart from an article published in 2005 by Kate McQueen Kate's, but thinking about how do you actually move people along this pipeline of just going from naive or unaware or neutral about research to really becoming champions. And this is in an advocacy state, but when we think about perhaps successful engagement, we want to move individuals along this pipeline and try to measure what areas, what mechanisms that we're deploying are actually helping to move people through this pipeline. So this is one area. This has been developed by FHI 360 in particular, Kate McQueen. This was originally presented at IAS 2019 in Mexico City. It's a theory of change around good participatory practice, and it's a complicated diagram, and so I'm not going to go through all of their work. This is a forthcoming paper, and we thank them for allowing us to share this work ahead of time. But thinking about engagement, what are the inputs that kind of go in these two large churning wheels, where we think about the mutual awareness and transparency, and then this sort of larger ethical wheel down at the bottom, minimizing risks and maximizing benefits that go in. And I often think about this as a really nice framework that even when we think about engagement on something like we want to increase diversity, that sometimes our efforts to do good engagement can actually lead to negative consequences. When we think about diversity, if we're only looking at perhaps geographic or biologic diversity, we are missing all the different ways that diversity can be measured. And so this helps provide that framework for putting in good inputs that really continue to churn out positive outcomes over time. And so again, thinking about the diversity example, the more diversity that you consider, the more positive outcomes that you can lead. So trying to think about your framework of your engagement practices across whether it be a single clinical trial or a research engagement program at a site, trying to provide a basis of this framework that can go over time. And this framework was actually developed with input from multiple stakeholder groups across multiple countries, looking at clinical trialists, community engagement staff, researchers, different funder perspectives, really trying to figure out what good engagement can look like and how to actually operationalize that at the site level. So certainly look forward to a forthcoming paper and to see this framework on the body of evidence that we mentioned. I also wanted to share just some lessons from HIV cure research and thinking about how you can measure this at the individual site level and over time and an investment in a program. And some ways that we've thought about it in the HIV cure space is thinking about measuring the quality of questions over time. How are people synthesizing information and moving their awareness, understanding of core concepts, thinking about how our partners are being elevated on panels. So how your engagement can raise that championship over time and move people along that pipeline. New CAB members are partners who come in from awareness events. How can awareness turn into activation of individuals who are able to really engage meaningfully on concepts across different information. So looking at both headlines and elements within WhatsApp groups or dialogues where these conversations are happening. And finally, I wanted to share one example of Outside In, and this is a piece that is also funded by the CASPER project, which is the Coalition to Accelerate and Support HIV Prevention Research. But this coalition in this particular group, TALC, the Treatment Advocacy Literacy Campaign in Zambia, engaged in outside-in engagement during the pop art study. And not only did they train local community groups and network leaders on good participatory practice, they actually developed tools to help evaluate the site level engagement and the site level examples or mechanisms of engagement for their effectiveness in the community that was rated by the community. So this community scorecard was given out to all of the different community leaders, CSO groups that were engaged and thinking about the research. And this actually gave the site some real-time insights into how their engagement strategy was penetrating into the local community and the effectiveness of the approaches that they were working with. And so this type of outside-in engagement or outside-in partnership is another really important model of how we think about measuring and evaluating community and learning from that in real time. So with that, I'm really excited we're not going to take any questions or comments now, but I'm going to actually hand over to Alun Davies, like we said, from MESH, to really begin to talk about some of the examples from the MESH cohort and thinking about what we can learn about research and evaluation in the community engagement, including a new course that MESH has just recently launched on strategies for engagement. So Alun, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Just wanted to say before we start, just looking at who's in the audience, it's really nice to see members of community advisory boards as well as researchers and engagement practitioners. So really lovely to see a nice mixture of people in the audience. Okay, so I'm Alun Davies, and I work for the Global Health Network, and I lead the mesh component of the Global Health Network. I've been working in community engagement, mostly in East Africa, in Kenya, but also in several multi-country engagement and research projects. Okay, so to tell you a bit about mesh. So mesh is three things, really. First of all, it's a knowledge community, or a community of practice, of engagement practitioners. And by now, that number there is a bit outdated. It's 5,000 people now who share their resources on our online hub. And that's the second component of mesh. It's the online hub where people share their resources. And the third component is a set of activities which are mainly led by mesh coordinators who are embedded within research institutions in Africa, in Latin America, and the Caribbean, and also in Asia. And those three coordinators, their role is to curate and share resources within those regions and beyond, to facilitate activities towards capacity strengthening for community engagement and involvement through workshops, webinars, online trainings, and also to foster collaborations. So just to talk a bit about what's on mesh, on the mesh website, we have a really wide range of resources on evaluating community engagement and involvement that ranges from theory-driven evaluations, theory of change and realist evaluation, to participatory methods, participatory visual methods as well, most significant change in other approaches as well. We have case study methods, and also we have methods of evaluating relationships and networks, and they're all freely available on that. You'll probably see that there's a QR code on the bottom there that you can scan if you want. You'll probably see that I've just learned how to use the QR maker, so I've peppered it all across my slides. So the thing that we're most excited by at the moment is that a group of us have been working together over the past 2.5 years to prepare a course which is titled An Introduction and Practical Guide to Community Engagement and Involvement in Global Health Research. And this course was co-funded by the National Institutes of Health and Care Research in the UK and MESH. And it brought together a bunch of experts in community engagement and involvement with research to author the course and also to peer review the course. So this course is freely available on MESH. There are 7 modules which can be taken at any time in any order, and there's no restriction in terms of when you do it. You can start now and end in a couple of years' time if you want. But people tend to do it all together in sequentially. The modules are understanding community engagement and involvement in health research, justifying CEI, considering stakeholders and engaging policymakers, how to make your community engagement and involvement ethical. Module 4 is on principles and models for CEI. And then in module 5, we draw on those principles and models with real life concrete examples of approaches and methods for CEI. Module 6 is on CEI partnerships, relationships, and project planning. And module 7, not to imply that evaluations should be done at the end of a project, but is on evaluation of CEI. So if you do those modules, then if you successfully complete the quizzes, then you get a certificate at the end of each module. So diving straight into module 7, and what we've included in this module was actually, we were very lucky. If I get any tricky questions this afternoon, I can pass on to the main author, who's Robin, who's on the panel here. And this module was co-authored with Roderick Sambakunzi of the Malawi Liverpool research program, and Noni Mumba of the KEMRI-Wellcome research program in Kenya. So broadly, this module delves into why it's important to evaluate CEI. It introduces some of the terminology like inputs, outputs, outcomes, indicators, and impact. It explores how the characteristics of CEI influence the evaluation approaches, and we look at how to plan evaluation to keep it simple, proportionate, and appropriate and manageable, and paying attention to practical ethical aspects of CEI. So in order to evaluate anything, it's really good to be clear about what the goals of engagement are. And so at the start of this module, we look at what the general purposes of CEI are. And of course, the goals of community engagement are quite wide-ranging, but these 4 purposes written down here articulate arguably the main purposes of CEI. That communities better understand research, and with this better understanding, research stakeholders have greater control of research agendas, that research is used in policy and practice, and research is better implemented. And you'll see on the right there that there's the graphic shows that peppered throughout this course interactive sessions where interactive activities that help learners get a grasp of the concept that's we're trying to get across. Then with the purposes, each purpose has a kind of expected change that you might want to see and that you might want to assess in an evaluation. For example, if the purpose is to ensure that research stakeholders control and shape the research process, then your evaluation would want to assess whether community input has influenced research priorities, design, and implementation. Again, there's a graphic, a picture of another type of matching activities which match the aims of the evaluation with the change expected. So we really get into understanding the types of question that we would want to ask within an evaluation. So we look at meaningful engagement. By meaningful engagement, we're kind of acknowledging the complex contexts in which engagements take place, and looking at whether engagement does give community stakeholders an opportunity to offer their input into the way research is done. And that evaluation looks at the process and quality of engagement, as well as the impacts of engagement. And we use a range of methods to look at what makes engagement meaningful and how to support that meaningfulness in engagement. So I guess the cartoon there is getting at whether evaluation is appropriate and proportionate to the activity that's being evaluated, and that the donkey is swinging the tail as opposed to the tail swinging the donkey, and that appropriate evaluation tools help with the evaluation questions that we want to be answered, and not the other way around, that we don't look at what the tools are first. We look at the questions first. It also emphasizes the importance of taking time away to reflect on some of the activities, and to think about evaluation, how we can keep improving that and improving our engagement processes throughout. So this is my last slide, really, and I'm showing it because it kind of highlights the gap that there is in training, or a need that there is for training, community engagement and involvement in GPP. In that we've just released the course for a month now, just over a month, a few days over a month, and we've already had 1,500 users, and we've already awarded well over 700 certificates by now. As I say, the course is freely available, and I encourage all the audience members to have a look at the course and see if it's appropriate for them. So thank you very much for that. Back to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Alun. And I can't really say how amazing that course is enough. It is really fantastic. And now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Sassy Molyneux to go into some of the real ID work that's been happening. So over to you, Dr. Molyneux.
Great, thank you. So just making sure I can see everybody. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you and we can see your slides.
Great. So as Alun said, it's just really nice to see people with lots of different roles here participating today, and also to see people from so many different parts of the world. So great to be here with you all. I'm Sassy Molyneux. I'm a professor in global health at the University of Oxford. But I think it's important to let you all know that most of my career I've been based in the KEMRI-Wellcome Trust program in Kenya, and over that career I've had an interest in health systems and research ethics studies, and I've been very interested in studying community engagement, but also helping to build up the community engagement program for the KEMRI-Wellcome Trust, which is a really large institution. And over many decades, myself and many others who are listed on this slide became interested in exploring really in more detail. Despite us doing a lot of research on community engagement, we wanted to learn a little bit more about how community engagement really works, for whom and in what contexts. And so we got a grant for a Realist review from Wellcome Trust. And we were aware that there's a huge literature out there that we could include in the review. So we decided to focus on large-scale malaria research programs as an entry point for this Realist review. And actually, I think what I'm going to say, in many ways, this study overlapped a lot with the development work of the course that you've just shared, Al. And I think hopefully the course that you've just described responds in some ways to some of the issues that I'm going to share as the findings of this Realist review. But I think a lot of the findings remain really relevant. So the review began sort of 5 years or so ago, and we were aware that, and everybody on this call will be aware, that there's a lot of investment that's gone into community engagement in health research by funders and by implementation organizations. And this is because of the hoped for values of community engagement in terms of ethical practice, in terms of making sure that the research is possible to do and that it's really as useful as possible. And there's lots of suggestions out there in the literature that these assumptions about the value of community engagement hold true. But there's really a lack of a very robust evidence base. And so we wanted to feed into this evidence base. And we were particularly keen to do this because there are a number of challenges, both for community engagement and for its evaluation. And that's that there's a lot of variability in what people mean when they're talking about community engagement. Is it CEI? Is it community engagement? Is it public engagement? Is it stakeholder engagement? And there are different not only language, but also concepts. There are all the different goals that are often not clear about what people are trying to achieve with community engagement. So there's a lot of variability in what community engagement is, what it's trying to achieve. And often there's a bit of an emphasis when you look at write-ups of engagement on the activities or the interventions. So, for example, the community advisory boards or the formative research process, rather than the nature of the interactions and relationships that community engagement is seeking to impact on, and the kind of mechanisms behind those impacts and how those impacts are achieved. And this is a really important limitation with some of the write-ups, because engagement activities are very complex social interventions effectively. They involve lots of different stakeholders often. And so it's really important to understand relationships, context, and culture. So a realist review, I'm not going to talk much about what a realist review is. We can do that in the discussion if you're keen to do so. But it's really appropriate for looking at these complex social processes with multiple stakeholders, and it's reviewing the existing literature that's out there, that's published. And it's really trying to explore how community engagement works. And so our review started with many, many more papers than you can see on this diagram. But what's important to show is at the bottom there, the total number of papers that were included in this review were not only the ones by the search strategy, but also conceptual resources that could help us understand what we were learning, and also other papers and outputs that we found in those publications that we could then learn from and pull in. We also made sure that we were engaging with many other people who are doing community engagement in different contexts in order to make sure that we were building on the rich experience and expertise on the ground of community engagement practitioners and experts. So I'm going to go straight to the findings and highlight that basically at the core of community engagement, what we found is that these engagements establish working relationships between researchers and local communities and other stakeholders. And these working relationships are built up by the interaction of 4 interlinked dynamics. So in those interactions with communities and research stakeholders, there's the exchange and negotiation over benefits. There's the responsiveness, ideally, to the issues that have been raised by community members. There's an interaction which is shaped often by researcher contiguity and familiarity. So that's frontline staff, the people who are actually conducting the research, being present and being able to build relationships and respond to the interests and needs that communities are raising. And what we see in these interactions is that it's really important in LMIC contexts what access to healthcare there is and how this is dealt with in research programs, and that all of these interactions contribute to community members accepting to be involved in research and participating in it to different depths. And all of these dynamics and interactions are shaped by the culture of engagement in an institution or a program, which is in turn shaped by that outer part of the diagram, which is the way research is generally done internationally in global health. So these things all influence the way in which relationships work across people who sometimes have different access to resources, different cultures, and different norms in terms of how they work and interact. So we thought it might be helpful to share with you an animation that we produced to summarize these findings, because they're really summarizing a very complex set of findings. So could I ask the animation to be shared, please?
In recent years, there's been an expansion of community engagement in health research as its benefits become more widely seen and understood. Community engagement is also known as community participation or public and patient involvement, and it is often understood as a range of activities that it encompasses, such as community meetings, setting up advisory boards, or involving local stakeholders in the design of interventions. However, what community engagement is and how it works in practice is far more complex than it might first appear. A review of published papers on community engagement in malaria research trials in low and middle-income countries highlights its role in enabling the development of precarious working relationships between researchers and local stakeholders. Rather than any specific engagement activities, it is these relationships that lead to greater acceptance and participation in the research by stakeholders, even though their motivations differ from those of researchers. While researchers may aim to produce high-quality research, in countries with under-resourced health systems, a primary motivation for local stakeholders to participate in the research is the accompanying benefit of access to healthcare. So these relationships rely on the exchange of tangible benefits by both researchers and participants and are built and maintained over time by respectful and considerate interactions. There are also wider contextual factors that, while not always visible, are powerful in shaping relationships. For example, behind the interactions can be important differences whereby senior researchers who are employed by universities or research institutions are in a position of relative wealth and power compared to many local stakeholders. In settings with high levels of poverty, the exchange of healthcare for research participation may leave people little choice but to enroll in the research, despite any concerns or misgivings, sometimes called structural coercion. The fact that high-income countries fund and control much of global health research can also undermine relationships, as local stakeholders may have less sense of control over the research. This may contribute to research not reflecting local priorities. Overall, the findings suggest that while the development of working relationships between researchers and local stakeholders helps to get research done, these relationships may rest on ethically problematic aspects of the way much global health research is typically carried out. If this is not acknowledged and challenged, there is a risk that community engagement entrenches rather than changes existing inequalities. To address these ethical challenges, researchers and funders must pay greater attention to the relational dynamics of engagement and consider wider contexts that influence these relationships. More structured support of frontline research staff by research institutions would help them navigate these relationships, but the wider context also needs to be addressed. Recognizing that access to healthcare is a primary motivation for research participation in some contexts suggests a need to consider how the infrastructure of health research could proactively support health systems in these settings. Relationships built through community engagement should complement and feed into engagement with health policymakers and managers to expand local ownership of health and research agendas. Ultimately, community engagement has the potential to help improve connections between health research and health systems and strengthen the ethics of research.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to try and share my screen again. Apologies, managed to lose where I was in that process. 1 minute. Great. So hopefully hearing Dorcas Kamuya's voice there, summarizing the findings, helps to really share in relatively straightforward ways quite a complex set of findings. And the overall conclusions, which are really relevant for how we evaluate community engagement, are that community engagement is much more about developing working relationships than any particular tool or method, like a community advisory board or a community meeting or a set of activities. Strategies for community engagement must be informed by an understanding of the relational dynamics of engagement and those contextual influences. There's the potential when working across difference, when developing working relationships across really big differences in wealth, in perceptions of health and well-being and so on, to accommodate and to reproduce the inequities in the way global health works, which is a major risk if we're not very careful in how we think through our community engagement. And if we do that, there's a real risk that in getting research done, we're reinforcing almost some quite ethically problematic ways about the way that research is done, for example, potentially undermining informed consent and voluntariness in research. And so what we've started to hint about, but that Robin will talk about more in his presentation, is that there is some illustration in our research of collaborative partnerships and the potential for these, but they needed to be taken forward in an alternative review. And so really the take-home message is that the way that this works in different contexts can serve to reinforce global health inequitable relationships and ways of working, or it can help to really transform it. And really we're interested in making sure our engagement transforms how global health research relationships work. In terms of our evaluation and thinking about community engagement moving forwards, we need to think about building relationships over time and beyond particular studies. We need to make sure that we're not only giving accurate information, but we're also listening and responding to issues that are being raised in the course of our interactions. We need often much more careful planning of engagement and developing really careful theories of change of what we're hoping to change, where and how, and making sure we're tracking that. And part of that is about tracking complex power relationships, and that's not easy to do with quantitative simple measures. And so building in careful reflections and debriefs as part of our community engagement is really key to not only the community engagement, but also to evaluation. And just to reiterate, that's something that I think, Alun, you raised several points with several times with the diagram of the big spanner, is being really proportionate in how we evaluate our community engagement. The evaluation shouldn't undermine the engagement itself, and we must make sure that it's all about achieving meaningful engagement, not meeting our impact targeted targets as measured quantitatively. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Molyneux. I think that Jessica is having some internet issues. We really appreciate that, and we'll look forward to hearing from Robin Vincent about REAL2.
Thanks a lot, Jen and the other panelists. Some really great stuff. I'm aware that we've thrown a lot of really rich material at you, so as participants, do feel free to start putting some questions in the chat that we can then harvest and return to after one more presentation, which is me. So can you see my slides there?
Yes.
Yep,
That
great,
looks
thank you.
great.
So I'm going to kind of build on, very much build on what Sassy said, to talk about REAL2, which is a realist review of participatory health research, which directly builds on the review that Sassy's just talked about, which was focused more on community engagement with research, whereas this is looking more broadly at participatory methods, which I will go into. So I'm going to just give a little bit of background about this new project, and it's fair to say it's early days. So I'm going to share some of the emerging issues with you for where they do overlap with this issue of looking at implications for evaluation of good participatory practice. And it's fair to say, I think building on some of those big issues that Sassy shared, some of these are about flagging areas that perhaps we need to evaluate better, or it'd be worth us getting clear about how we evaluate them. So some of this is a little bit upstream at this stage, but in the spirit of raising important issues that we all need to address in our engagement and participation work. That's the way we're framing it. So we're kind of 8 months into a scoping phase with this REAL2, which is specifically looking at participatory research in health, where we've been talking to a lot of practitioners and scholars and reviewing some of the key papers and material that's out there. And just to link back to what Sassy described on REAL1, that kind of finding that the working relationships between researchers and communities were really key, but also ambivalent or ambiguous, because they got research done, but they were potentially ethically problematic, is a really key thing that we wanted to build on. And it led us to think about doing REAL2, which would explore the limits and potential of greater community involvement in research by looking at the research literature that's more explicitly participatory. So not just major biomedical trials, but health research that deliberately goes about doing things in a different way. And it's fair to say this was to sort of see what we could learn to enhance existing community engagement, particularly with large trials and biomedical research, but also illuminate some of the perhaps complementary research approaches that we might want to bring in if we're to get a fuller picture. So it's very much a both and in the way that we're approaching it. And at the moment, we're just about to start the full review. We've kind of finalized a review question, and we've begun to develop some initial explanations about how participatory research works, which I'll dip into in a minute. So it's early days. Sassy and I are, again, co-PIs on the team, and we have Realist expertise, a number of other team members and advisors linked to the previous work, but also new as well. So we've got a fantastic team. A key distinction to make that came out of our scoping is that between participatory research, which is actually labelled under a number of these different terms, where really the core of it is about people being affected by the issue that's being studied, being involved throughout the research process. That's a key tenet for people who are involved in participatory research. And comparing that with a number of approaches which are, in a sense, a little bit more partial. This isn't to sort of judge them, but it's to say that the participation may be at one stage of the research or a number of stages of the research, but not the whole process. So there is a distinction there. And it's fair to say in our community engagement review, and that Sassy talked about, we kind of identified some of this in a way, the limits to how much participation there was involved, despite the language and the terms being reminding you of that graphic that she shared, basically looking at that potential to reproduce the kind of dominant way of doing research, which may not involve participation to the maximum degree, or the ability to build on a wider collaborative partnership. So that's the kind of space of tension that we're working in this review. And just to sort of make the parallels with good participatory practice, I think most of us would agree that being more explicit and consistent about participation with the guidelines around good participatory practice that have increasingly been brought into global health research is really, really important. But there's also an issue around the kind of procedures and the things you can put on paper and the approaches that are suggested, and actually the terms of participation that are decided outside of the research encounter. So when people are involved in research in various ways, they bring a number of different things that kind of structure their participation or affect whether indeed they can participate. And this is where we thought there'd be really some really useful insights from participatory research to enhance the participation with trials and more sort of traditional large research, but also maybe to complement them too. This is a very messy slide, but it summarizes a number of things that have come out in our scoping phase. And to help you navigate it, I would just briefly say that we found issues at a number of levels, from the project stakeholder level all the way up to the national, regional and international level. And that was to say that there are aspects of knowledge generation going on at all of these levels that do or don't address power, more or less address power. And some of that's linked to the purposes of research and what people are trying to do with that research. So broadly, we were looking at where these things interface. And when it comes to good participatory practice, it's fair to say, I think it's that middle level of looking at where participation can enhance clinical trials or research that's perhaps done in a more traditional biomedical paradigm. And as I've said, we're interested in that, but we're also interested in some of the wider wraparound that looking at participatory research brings into view. Another very messy slide. The purpose of this one, this is our very early sketch of what it's all about, which in realist terminology is your sort of program theory, your initial hypothesis about how things work. And really it's to show that for participatory health research, there are some quite distinctive things. In that middle circle, you've got cycles of collective analysis and action. So people building on their own experience, reviewing that, reflecting on it, very much people being involved and building on their own experience of a particular issue. And in this case, that would be health. The importance of creating safe spaces to do that. But if you look at the things like co-governance of research and dedicated time together to build relationships, which Sassy flagged in REAL1, there are some overlaps. There are some sort of common learning, if you like. So this all points in the direction of there maybe being some commonalities, but also some areas where there needs to be an expansion of effort. And just to sort of pick up on that last slide, I think, again, this is an issue of kind of complementarity. There may be some other kinds of research that are being missed by your dominant focus on trials, but there may also be some valuable learning around where perhaps something like co-governance can make sure people can have a role in setting the priorities of that research. So again, trying to look at those complementarities. I won't dwell on this. This is for any realist nerds, of which there probably aren't many in the room. But essentially, when you're doing a realist analysis, you try and look at the kind of key ingredients of what's going on, in this case, participatory research, and what are the major contexts that influence that particular process. And as I've already flagged, we're looking at power, the role of lived experience, and looking at to make sure that the research has an impact in the real world. How am I doing for time? I realize I've got quite a lot in here. I'll whistle through the last few bits. So we've done a scoping sort of for the last 8 months, as I said, and we pulled together some key issues in a working paper. And I just wanted to give a little tour of some of those issues and just try where I can to draw out where they relate to evaluation questions. So 3 main areas were really looking at power sharing or power shifting at a range of levels in the research process. Another was the role of lived experience. How can that be brought more centrally into research processes and link up with understandings of objectivity and validity in research? And finally, the challenge of linking sort of local research, inquiry and action into broader changes in social life. So I'm going to just look at those briefly in turn. So the first one is looking at the benefits and challenges of shifts in power. And power is one of those things that there's a lot of talk about, but it's actually quite hard to get your hands on what it means in practice. So there's a real need to look at processes of relationship building, spaces of participation, aspects of knowledge generation, and the fact that they actually involve different kinds of power, different mechanisms at each level. And that's one of the things our review will try and at least clarify. Particularly important for participatory research is what's been called power within, which is essentially confidence and capacity of communities to, in a sense, articulate their own agenda and their own issues. And there's another important element of how power might mean some people never really get to sit at the table in the first place. So really important to look at how this can be sort of dealt with or head off. And I think one of the issues is about how you can mitigate power by looking at things like co-governance. There've been some really useful attempts at getting people involved in priority setting and in actually designing research, major clinical trials in the north of the US on smoking cessation and other things with native communities. So there's some really good examples to draw on then about how you can make sure people don't get co-opted into research, but actually have more power in that process. But there's also important to just keep in mind, while we're focused on maybe participatory practices in the research encounter, some of those wider contexts and influences that will affect who gets to sit at the table and how they react. And I think that was very eloquently covered in the last presentation by Sassy on some of those sort of trade-offs. A second major area in participatory health research is balancing working with sort of lived experience and people's particular experiences of particular settings and kind of what you do with that. And for participatory research scholars, there's a principle of no delegation, which is saying actually people's lived experience should be central and they should be central to doing their own analysis. And obviously that area parts ways to a certain extent with what we understand as traditional clinical health research. And there's a range of debates around objectivity and embodied knowledge which come in there. There's also increasing recognition that when you look at health as a complex system, you need to access lots of diverse experiences and different takes on that system to be able to fully understand it. But I think there's also some sort of agendas here for those involved in looking at participatory practice. And I think one of those is just to make sure there's a recognition that other kinds of research may be complementary to clinical trials. It's not an either or, but it's whether it's informing the focus of those trials or whether it's looking at things that they are sort of almost too focused to take into account. There's an important area there. And I think drawing on people's lived experience in priority setting and in actually setting the research agenda and making sure it's looking at the right things in the first place is another area of confluence, I think, between the areas. And then finally, just to say a little bit about linking local inquiry and action to broader change. This comes up particularly in participatory research because people are involved in sort of exploring an issue and the way it plays out may be very particular to that local context. So how do you draw out generalizable learning? How do you build a broader picture? And that's one of those classic debates in sort of objectivity and science. How do you do that? And there's a number of sort of promising methods in participatory work which look at kind of how you can link up learning from different places and build a broader picture. I think one of the interesting areas for concern is looking at the possibilities that approaches to health give you, whether it's a vertical focus on diseases and commodities, or whether there's a more horizontal approach, which people would recognize in comprehensive primary healthcare, some of the work on social determinants of health. And we found that these two framings provide different opportunities, if you like, for doing participation. Some of them are more amenable to a participatory approach than others. So that's another interesting area to look at. And I think broadly, some of the other bullets here, I think, are more linked to the actual participatory process itself. But where they link perhaps to good participatory practice is that question of the purpose of research and the social value of research, and making sure that the research that is done is appropriate to context and addresses some of the practical realities on the ground. So a number of overlaps there. And as I said, these are sort of, in a sense, quite upstream. and it's early days, but we're hoping, as with REAL1, to distill some practical recommendations around how these things can be engaged and evaluated. Great, I shall leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I think first is such a really whirlwind tour of all of this fantastic work. We would love to have questions and comments. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I will sort of take a moderator's prerogative and maybe ask the first one. And I think it could go to all of you, but I think in particular, kind of hearing about the power dynamics that Robin talked about, but then also the intensive work, Sassy, that you mentioned, and kind of going into REAL1 at around the relationship dynamics. Something I'm really interested in is what is the role of community engagement, not just should it go beyond just sort of evaluating those relationships between healthcare systems, or should it actually, is the goal of engagement to push the environment to actually improve the infrastructure around it, similar to the ways that clinical research does by investing in infrastructure building in capacities and centers and testing sites. Should engagement be trying to push those relationships to be more progressive and more of that and more accepting to try to change those power dynamics? Is that the role of engagement?
Maybe I can be a little irritating in responding to that, first of all, by saying it's always very important to think through what is the goal of the engagement. And, you know, in some ways in this webinar, we've talked about a potential spectrum from lighter forms of engagement to get some feedback and interaction on how something might be slightly better. A research project might be slightly better tailored and so on, through listening carefully to what local priorities and concerns are, to the opposite end of the spectrum, if you really want to see it in that way, which is kind of co-designing a new way of doing research, or even research priorities in the first place, or what questions should be asked. And I think across all of that, being clear about what the intention is, I think, is a really important part, and maybe even discussing that intention with, you know, stakeholders, including community members, is important. But across all of those activities, I think one of the big learnings for me, having been involved in a lot of community engagement activities, is if one is not really aware of the wider power dynamics that we're all operating within, there's a risk that we just replicate relations without changing them, even at a micro everyday way of interacting level. If it becomes a mechanics of doing the engagement and isn't thoughtful and aware of the power relations and seeking to change them almost continuously, then there's a risk that regardless of where you're at across that spectrum, it reinforces things that we ultimately, if we really thought about it, wouldn't be that happy with. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's the thought.
No, I think it does. I think, you know, what I really took away with is that engagement does have the power to shift there, or has the power to kind of shift that power dynamic. And actually, perhaps, maybe I think this is one of the goals of engagement should be to create a more equitable power structure, and that it shouldn't just be the status quo, but like you were saying, you sort of have to be aware of all of that. I know we're at the top of the hour, but I do want to take some time, if others do have some questions, to please put them in the chat. But one thing for Alun, I did want to ask is, you know, who is the primary audience for the monitoring evaluation efforts through the course? And just to get your perspective on who really needs to understand the outcomes of this work.
Well, just to answer your question, the Global Health Network last year did a survey of 3,700 or so people working around health and health research around the world. And we asked them what the what the barriers to research was, and access to training ranked really highly amongst the top 4 activities, or the top 4 barriers to conducting research. And so we're kind of addressing that gap, really. So we think the types of people who want to access the course and who want to learn about how do I plan a strategy for engaging communities with health research, I think the majority of people who attend the courses are engagement practitioners, but also we have researchers, PIs, who also want to learn how to plan their strategies for engaging communities with their specific research. But we also have people from cross disciplines, from people working in health promotion, who also draw on some of the same principles of community engagement. So it's kind of why, I mean, it's open to anyone can access it. But I would say that the biggest group of people are a kind of early career engagement practitioners, really.
Great. I think that's really helpful to hear. I think, and it's, it's interesting about, I think, PIs in particular, how they can design better research programs and design community engagement in a better way. And I think that's often a group that's overlooked. I think community engagement often focuses on the practitioners themselves and not on sort of the environment and the ecosystem that really helps facilitate that. Because as all of this is, it's all quite complex, right, and layered. So I do want to open it up if there's any questions in the chat, or any questions from those in attendance. Please feel free to raise your hand, or again, write them into the chat. We're welcome to hear your voice and to share experience as well.
Just to add to that,
again, as we wait
response as well, Jess, is that, I guess, what one positive change that we've seen amongst some funders, not all funders, is that currently a couple of the larger funders really demand to see engagement up front to feed into not just ongoing research, but to feed into the planning of engagement. And I see that as a big step forward in terms of making sure that researchers consider engaging communities right at the outset, right at the planning stages.
Jump in. I think Jessica may be having, oh, go ahead. I'm not seeing any more. We'll just, I know people might have had to jump off at the top of the hour, but for anyone who has remaining questions, feel free to raise your hand or pop them in the chat. And an additional question we have for any of you, but in particular, I think for Dr. Molyneux, is I think that for many practitioners of GPP,
are you able to hear me? Apologies.
Yes.
You disappeared, Jess, and then you've just come back. Jen, do you want to carry on, Jen, and give us your...
Sure, yes. Is that it's difficult. I think there are networks and there are funders who are requiring community engagement, but it's often not well budgeted or well funded, or it's difficult to make room for. And curious to hear your thoughts and recommendations and how it is that you've made room for not only the community engagement but the evaluation then of the community engagement and the participatory practice, and your thoughts about the resourcing it.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think in the particular institution that I was in, and in my own particular research, we've been fortunate that the funder is extremely and the funders have been extremely supportive, and we've actually designed some research questions around looking at this, and that's also been separately funded as a research activity. I think it's really, where the funders are not funding it separately, I think it's just really important to fold it into the research itself and show that it's just built into good research practice and part of doing ethical research. So if the terms community engagement are not necessarily prioritized, often doing ethical research that's locally relevant is possible to argue for and difficult to argue against by funders. And so emphasizing that, I think, is really important in applications.
Yeah. So just as I apologize, my internet is a bit unstable, but hopefully that technical glitch has been fixed. I'm curious about that. Interest is, how do you work across, or how can we incorporate it, better monitoring evaluation across the different trials that are happening, right? Because I think that there is individual researchers who pick it up with their individual clinical trials, but at the site level, right, this is, you know, you may be doing Ebola research, you may be doing COVID vaccine research, you may be doing HIV prevention research. And how do we allow for this type of work to happen, not just at individual funder levels, but at the site level to evaluate across all these programs? And I think that's something that I struggle with all of these tools as well. So I'm curious, within all of your evaluations, how you have found the how sites can implement monitoring evaluation, not just trial by trial, but really across the program of research.
I think if sites have got a lot of trials going on, then they have resources. It's otherwise they wouldn't be doing the trials. And so I think Tando has made a comment that, you know, even those that are funded, the funds can be stolen internally to other things. I think it's about, you know, that diagram I showed of the circles in the middle there is institutional support. So there really needs to be institution building around a supporting engagement as a culture, as a requirement, as a cross-program, cross-trial requirement. And that can be at an individual research institution, at universities, at programs of research. And yeah, so trying to make sure that there are the resources in terms of personnel, there's the culture and support for that, and that slowly over time, through steps, it's made clear that it's unacceptable not to be thinking carefully about these things.
I was just going to pick up on that, and also Al's point about the movement of funders, because I think there's those efforts that you've just described, Sassy, of being creative and making sure it's taken seriously, which that does rely on, in a way, on the commitment of researchers, which is really, really important. And I think you've seen increasingly a readiness for some funders to look at partnership and relationship development as a precursor to sort of specific pieces of research. And interestingly, in relation to REAL, obviously we were funded by Wellcome to do that, and some of the conclusions around relational dynamics and building relationships have been very much taken to heart in terms of the ingredients that they look to support within engagement. But it's also a long-term thing. It's about looking longer term than the very short funding cycles of research, and that's a broader problem, I think, whether it's research or sort of international development programming, which I think there's a lot to be said for learning from, really.
Yeah, and there are some really wonderful, you know, site centers of excellence that are really operationalizing engagement in that way. And I think that's something we didn't really talk about, is how do you monitor not just the impact that it has in the broader community, but also the internal, perhaps, movement, right? And how you're operationalizing it in a better way, and training around that. So I think that those are all certainly some internal pieces that need to happen. But and excited to see some of the comments. Yeah, Khadija Richards puts, yeah, funding needs to be broadly aligned to local objectives determined by absolutely local constituencies who build their term, yeah, relationships with researchers. Thank you so much for sharing that as well. And certainly the idea of separate funding for engagement, I think in the same way, often institutions, right, fund capacity building for early career investigators in research, as well as infrastructure when it comes to building clinics and labs. Engagement should have the same level of support, right, and a pipeline that kind of comes in and thought about within the research landscape. So certainly more things to happen. And perhaps these frameworks can really help us evaluate that change over time, not just again at the impact of the site, but thinking about that global ecosystem of engagement.
Just in responding to your previous questions about, you know, how do you evaluate across different types of trials, and just to make the point that engagement might or GPP, or you know, whatever you want to call it, might look different depending on the type of trial that you're dealing with. For example, if you look at a field-based vaccine trial, the type of recruitment and consequently the type of engagement that you might want to do would look very, very different to a hospital-based treatment trial. In that, you know, you might well talk to different audiences and different stakeholders, and therefore your kind of monitoring and evaluation might look slightly different as well, depending on the type of trial. I guess ultimately it really depends on what the goals are. And you know, in any kind of engagement strategy, you can have a range of goals that you're trying to address through your engagement program. I guess one really important perspective would be to monitor the impacts that engagement has on the trial, the way it's run. That would be a really, really important aspect of monitoring and evaluation, is to kind of make note of the real changes that community stakeholders can have on the way trials are selected in the first place, but also modified to make them appropriate.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, how do you raise a champion for engagement? And I think, you know, monitoring that is so important, and something that we really value and think have thought deeply about at AVAC is how do we think about creating those champions for engagement as a whole, and how they can make an impact. So really completely agree. But Sassy, it looked like you had your hand up to say something before, so wanted to make sure you get a chance to speak.
Oh, no, it was just I was enjoying reading the comments and just very much agreeing with the comments that have been written there. And I think, you know, context sensitivity is so important in any of the thinking around engagement activities and evaluations. So context sensitivity in terms of what's feasible and manageable and needed in particular environments, but also multiple things often. So it will be that, if possible, to do a bit of community engagement funding specifically, and to try to ensure that all researchers are thinking about it and building it in, and developing institutional policy if possible, to make sure that everyone's having to think of that even before they submit research grants for funding, so that it becomes a kind of typical thought process, and that people talk about it in institutions and in communities. So I was just enjoying, and sorry that we can't directly respond to the comments coming in through the chat.
And I was just going to add, not only is there that issue that Ntando pointed out about funding being sort of stolen from other things when it could be there for engagement, when it comes to evaluation of engagement, then even more likely to sort of find you haven't got the resources or the time. And I think that circles us back to the things Al was flagging in the CEI course, which is that issue of being proportionate and just taking time to reflect on the things that matter. And I think there's a lot of mystique around evaluation as a great big technical exercise that has to be done at large scale, but actually just taking time to think about what's key and finding ways to assess that can make a massive difference. So it's a sort of plea to try and keep things simple as far as possible.
Wonderful. And we did have a question come into the chat. How do you begin engaging with communities when the research is in preclinical stage? What product do you engage on, and when there is none yet? And I think that this is a really important conversation, at least in the HIV space. Think about this more upstream basic science. How do you really begin to have that work early on? I think this could go to anybody. I mean, I'm happy to share some AVAC examples as well, but given the panel of experts, maybe we could turn to
But,
Sassy
I mean,
or Alun.
maybe rather than address the question, I can kind of emphasize on the value of doing it, or almost an obligation to do it, in that that funding in many cases, not all cases, for engagement comes from kind of taxpayers' money, I guess. And so in a way, you could argue that, you know, that researchers have an obligation to engage with publics and communities who pay taxes, and who's not only that, but, you know, if preclinical research goes on in public facilities like hospitals, then, you know, there is some kind of obligation to be accountable to publics about how that money is being spent. So just wanted to make that point initially, but not. I realize I'm not answering the question. I'll pass that to Robin and Sassy.
Thanks, Joelle. I'm not sure if that's how we say your name, but I'd love you to, if you've got a concrete example, that can be quite helpful, I think, because in terms of building relationships with communities and thinking about what research is and what value research can have, at least we've found, away from particular studies, that more general interaction to talk about, for example, if there's an institution in an area, or there's a body of work that's happening, just to know what is research, what can that add, how can communities contribute. So much more general relationship building can then help to inform the more specific research ideas as they evolve, but it's very context specific.
Yeah, I think I would build on Sassy's point that I do think that as you get into more and more upstream basic science research, the investment that you need to make, not just around awareness, but in really building maybe a smaller, but really investing in those community relationships, because it is so much harder to have meaningful engagement as the science is. You're really making directions about where a product could go or where a clinical trial design could happen. And so you need a deeper knowledge, and that engagement isn't just about awareness, but building that very early on, that you could shape the direction of the field is really critical. And so an important thing to have. But yeah, understanding, I think, what maybe disease area or product you're thinking about would certainly be helpful. And I do think people have the power to come off mute. There are people with more technical expertise than myself who would know that. But if you do feel like it, please raise your hand, and we can certainly bring your voice into the conversation as well.
Just saying that, Ntando, you've got some great points there. Absolutely agree with you.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. So just for those who may be on their phones, Ntando really raises this great point that I think the idea of engagement in small scale trials speaks to how engagement is separated to a trial, yet the organizations who do these trials have worked in other trials. So engagement should not be separated into small or large scale trials. And I think that that's really important, that ultimately on the ground, an engagement program is actually disease agnostic or trial agnostic. It's really about the relationships with that community. And again, in the same way that a lab isn't built just for a specific type of research, but, you know, any kinds of machines can test different diseases or different kinds of tests. So making sure that, I think that that's such an important point, that there's this expertise, and it should be valued regardless of the size or the phase of research that you're in. Yep, and what's done today builds what happens tomorrow, and that's absolutely right, Ntando. Other comments or questions from those in the chat or those in the audience? Again, please feel free to raise your hand to bring your voice into the conversation. I think with that, we'll just thank our panelists for sharing their time, their expertise, and yes, their insights with us. I think it's been a really fantastic conversation discussion. We'll be able to share the recording as well as some of the resources that were put into the chat. So if you missed any of the QR codes, don't worry about that. We'll be able to send the link so that you can access the course and the various papers and that were shared today. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Alun, Sassy, and Robin, for your time today. It was really a fantastic conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.